Over to you, Alex.
Okay, so I'm sorry, it's just me today. We have this unfortunately coincided with a cross university ref meeting. So Tim is representing both of us at that Program Halton Research this morning, so you've just got me. But we have collaborated a little bit around what we wanted to say and the kind of context that we wanted to explore. Jeff wanted us to talk about policy. I've just had a view, so I've changed my policy today, and
it's on the table, I think. Sorry, Alex.
This one, then.
Yeah, this one.
Jeff wants to talk about policy. We kind of did scratch our heads a little bit to think, what is our policy around creative doctorates? And I'm not sure that we have a policy as such. We don't have a piece of paper or a document or an implementation plan to support this. I think it's much more around our academic commitment to understanding research in a kind of broad framework. Tim is head of research in arts design and media, and I'm responsible for research and research development in health, education and life sciences. In some ways the kind of the creative turn makes more sense, or it's more kind of common sense for the grammar of ADM when Tim works. With us, it's probably been a little bit more of a self-conscious piece of work really to get this kind of thing going in health, education and life sciences, where we are predominantly a practice-based faculty. We train the majority of teachers, social workers, nurses, physiotherapists, midwives, radiographers, what have I missed, and so on, and so ODPs for the region and beyond. We are one of the biggest providers of teacher and nurse education in the country. So our traditions and our epistemologies are much more social science led, and so working in a kind of a cross paradigm of embracing more creative practice has been a more I suppose intellectual journey for us, in the sense that we have made a conscious decision that this is an area of work that we want to work in. So I think rather than the policy, there is a kind of strong academic commitment to creative practice. So the job that Tim and I have is to nurture and support an environment within which this kind of work becomes possible, plausible, defendable, and necessary, I suppose, as well. So it's kind of creating the academic framework within which it becomes important to pay attention to this kind of work. So one of the things we all come up against regularly, and I don't know whether this makes, when you think about your regulations, I think it's maybe a point of discussion a bit later on, whether that's something that makes you groan or something you feel relatively comfortable with. But I think that our thinking around the regulations is that we always think about it as a kind of productive conversation. The regulations are there to protect us, they're there to protect our students, and rather see them as kind of barriers. We kind of think, well, how can we engage with these productively in order to do the things that we want to do? Now, we are very lucky at BCU that we had a recent revision of our regulations, and this is the kind of key section of our regulations that governs all of our postgraduate research activity. So any candidate is allowed to submit evidence of creative achievement, as long as it's their own work, and obviously it does have to be completely their own work, and in any field. So the ones that they listed in the original reworking of the regulations for fine art, design, engineering, technology, the obvious kind of areas. Our areas in education, health and life sciences don't appear there, you'll notice. And so that's been that's the journey we're on at the moment, is what does this mean in the context of our disciplines in our faculty. But the regulations are very much not a barrier, and I do think it's interesting the point Jeff made about the kind of 2002 shift, that I'm not actually sure before that point that regulations were ever a barrier. I mean, I did my PhD back in the day, in a much more traditional environment, where there wasn't a kind of legacy for me to follow in my institution of doing a creative PhD in education, but I didn't find the regulations to be a barrier, because your job as a PhD student is to present a theoretical case. So I think it's always possible to argue from an academic perspective why you must do what you're doing in the way that you're doing it, and that's part of the discipline, isn't it, of doing doctoral work. I think the particular challenge for us is around what the submission looks like. I know even in arts, design and media that continues to be a challenge. I chaired a viva in the conservatoire a couple of years ago, which was a composition piece from a jazz musician, and again it was a really interesting discussion between the candidate but also the two examiners on how the research processes were demonstrated and how the kind of paradigm that the candidate was working in were discussed and explicated through the work. So just because you're working in a creative area, it doesn't mean that working creatively is a straightforward process. There are still some really important and interesting academic debates being played out in those areas. But I think we are probably, I don't know how many other people's regulations are similar to these. So we all have this kind of generosity. You don't? No.
Sometimes we don't.
No. So we do have a bit of an open door, and that helps. But as I say, I don't think we should ever see the regulations as a barrier. That's part of the engaging in the academic process. So I think Tim and I would probably say, rather than policy, we have a series of enablers that create a certain kind of ethos. But I think we will both also argue, we were having this discussion earlier in the week, that these are just for us the usual cornerstones of our academic practice. We don't think there's anything special or unusual probably about what we do. And these are kind of what we would expect to see anywhere anyway. So really creative practice should be something that can flourish just if we're doing academic practice in the right way. So we think there's a lot to be said about establishing trust, about supporting risk-taking, but also the thinking about the counter of that. What are the dangers of playing safe? I think my view of doing doctors is if our students have to play safe, then we may as well just all pack up and go home. We're supposed to be working at the cutting edge, we're supposed to be working in that really exciting liminal space where we're creating new insights, new perspective, we're really pushing at the boundaries. If that's not about risk-taking, then we've probably taken a wrong turn around what our doctoral programmes look like. We need to be able to accept failure if we're going to support experimentation, but obviously not in the viva. We don't want people to fail in the end. And we haven't seen that, I can reassure you. We haven't just suddenly seen a downturn in our pass rates. And we have good solid pass rates here. People make good progress in good time. And it's something we're tightly focused on, particularly around the professional doctorate that I know colleagues are going to talk about a bit later on. I think you also have to be open to sharing practice and anxieties, and some of these issues around what does an education PhD look like, or what does a health PhD look like, are things that are openly on the table. I can't say that I'm not anxious about some of the things that are on their way to examination in the next couple of years. I would be a fool if I said I wasn't worried about people singing and dancing and making and playing in my discipline. But we are having a lot of conversations across the university about how we manage that in our discipline. So ADM, they've been the kind of pioneers in this area. So Tim and I are meeting with the ex-chair of the 2014 Art and Design panel to talk about what we can learn from those processes and the kind of reassurances that we can get. So there is a kind of lot of work to do to quell those anxieties. But in a way, being anxious is part of the risk-taking process. If I haven't got a little bit of anxiety, then we're probably not doing it right. But it's kind of my job to be the anxious one, so that people around the table at the back can kind of get on with their exciting work. So there's a lot of modelling going on. You've seen Jeff before already this morning, and we try as hard as we can to be experimental in our own work. My colleague Mandy and I performed. I think our debut performance of our ethnodrama was at the UKCGE conference a couple of years ago. And following that, we did get quite a lot of requests to re-perform it, didn't we? We were a bit bored of it by the end of it, but we still got some good feedback on it. But there's a lot of learning as well in terms of new ways of being and doing that you have to do in order to get this work through. Amanda will talk about this kind of more creative aspects of our professional doctorate a bit later on. And I have to say, the original validation of that back in 2011-12, me and Tony were the only people in the team, I think, who were here then. We've kind of expanded our team significantly since then. It was quite an uphill struggle to get the validation panel to accept that we weren't going to say what the assessment was going to be. We wanted it to be completely open, completely negotiable, and they completely shut us down on it, and we had to go away and write this palliative assessment, which was 16 different assessment opportunities, with the last one being, and anything else you want to do. So we ended up in exactly the same position, but we did have to kind of play the game and think about how we were going to perform the traditional role of being in a validation panel. We've also had to think about new ways of assessing, and I think for the first couple of years, even though we had some quite open opportunities on that particular module, all the students wrote 5,000 word essays and turned in 5,000 word essays. And we were like, well, we said you can sing, you can dance, you can model, you can make films, why aren't you doing any of these things? And they were nervous about our experience as assessors of new kinds of work. So we did have to do quite a lot of work to support our own sophistication around assessing creative practice. So there is a lot of work to do around academic identities of tutors and assessors as well as students, because students need a safe place to play, and they can only have that kind of reassurance if your criteria, if your assessment processes, if your approaches to assessment support and reassure that they are going to be safe when they hand in their song or they dance their dance or whatever it is that they're wanting to do. And as you can see outside, we've moved a long way from that collection of 5,000 word essays. They still have to do that work. I think anyone who's on any of our courses will know that we still are kind of hard taskmasters in terms of the writing we expect people to do. But they can be experimental, or they can be experimental with their writing as well. So Claire's nodding away. There's one of my PhD students who challenges me in every session, I ought to say, with what she brings in a good way. Okay, so some of the enablers and some of the things we're doing, these are some of the kind of activities that we've been getting stuck into to kind of help us to build this ethos. Jeff's going to talk about the Bespoke Supervision training a bit later on. He's already mentioned that, but we kind of hijacked that from the more sort of come in and find out about the regulations, which was our previous approach to supervisor training. Everyone had to do sort of 2 or 3 days, and it was mostly about regulations, mostly regulations driven. We hijacked that program. It's now owned by the Associate Dean's Group, run by Jeff, but it's pedagogically driven. So there is an input on these are the regs, but the priority of the program is to be reflexive about pedagogies. And we've got a CEDA program. Well, I'm not going to steal Jeff's thunder by talking about that, but it's quite a unique model, and I think colleagues who've been on it, we've had very good evaluations, I think it's fair to say, on that program. We also do some explicit teaching around this kind of practice. So we have a Prof Doc framework, which I led the redevelopment of last year, which allows encourages creative practice. And then on our ND program, which Amanda's going to talk about in a little while, we do explicitly teach through creative methodologies. So we are, I guess, we set the agenda around creative practice. We have a number of research groups across the university with creative orientation. We also work across faculties. We have a number of cross-cutting research groups that are focused on creative practice. And again, other people will be talking about some of those as the day goes on. And we sponsor doctoral work that provides the kind of theoretical background to some of this stuff. So the little research group that Claire is part of is doing some of the theoretical thinking around what happens when you put creative practice into social science driven context. So we're funding that work, we're supporting that work so that we have a kind of new body of knowledge that supports and underpins some of our future work. We're making spaces, and that's physical spaces as well as intellectual spaces. So we in Hells we will have our first studio as from May the 1st, when we move into our new research hub. And that's something we've never had before, we've never really thought about before, and our colleagues have worked in borrowed spaces in ADM or in the teacher education part of the building, but we've realised if we want to let this happen, we need to build some space. So Tony's headache for the last couple of months has been trying to get a sink put into a listed building, so they don't have to keep running up and downstairs to wash their hands. Next one's really important. I mean, again, this goes back to kind of identities and the kind of things you need people to do. We all need external examiners to come in and make a judgment about what our students are doing. So building those networks of external examining is really important. And I know some of my I think I've done 15 exams in the last 36 months just to make sure I've got my people ready to come and examine my students. And so it's building those network of people who it's safe to put your students in front of. We know that external examining is part of the game, and getting the right examiner, someone who will be positive, rigorous, but positive, someone who will work with your students to understand what they've been kind of grappling with, and how, in some ways, how much more difficult it is to do the theoretical work they need to do in order to produce a credible, creative piece of work. Because they're kind of performing in two spaces. They're performing in a creative space, but also in an intellectual space. So they've got to there's a double bind there. And having an external examiner who will work with them on that, I think, is really important. So it's something you do need to give some thought to, because there's no point having all these people coming up for exam and then thinking, oh my word, who are we going to put them in front of? So that's, I think, been a really important strategic priority for us. And then working through some stuck points together, so you will come up against those things. What are we going to do with X, or what are we going to do with Y, or what are we going to do about this or that? And I think doing that en masse, doing that openly, sharing those anxieties, sharing those worries is really important, and that has to be something you do across faculties. You have to be, there's no point in doing that in your own little corner. You will get the best expertise, advice, support if you work with your wider community. But you'll also get some good arguments from other parts of the university, things you might not have thought about before, insights you might not have brought to your own work. So I think we do a lot of that, particularly between our two faculties in ADM and Health. Also working between institutions, so we have a good relationship. So with Oxford Brookes, Tony and takes a whole group of students down to Oxford Brookes every year, working with Brighton, down with Gina Whisker. So we've established a kind of network of universities where we know we're on the same page, and where our students can have interesting and productive conversations. And then working and building specialist networks and communities, so opportunities for sessions like this where we can bring together people to help us to kind of mull over some of the things that we're struggling with. So don't be surprised if you get a call to be one of our external examiners. There's a kind of, there's method in us making the effort for today. You never know what you might get called in to do after this. So that's just some, I think they're not very good photographs actually, they look better on the exhibition. That's part of the exhibition that Jeff and colleagues staged at our recent health conference. And again, it was a first for health to have the keynote was done by the group. The exhibition was outside the keynote room, and then there was a kind of Q&A with the panel discussion with our group of presenters whose work you can see outside. And it was really, really well received, but it was the first time that our health community had really kind of come into contact with this kind of work. And so I guess finding spaces within the university to kind of trouble the common sense grammars of disciplines is really important, and it was a great exhibition. So I just wanted to leave with some prompts really. Jeff was encouraging us to keep the day discursive. So I thought I'd finish with some questions to you about where you see the barriers and enablers to creative practice in your own institution. And again, a kind of encouragement to think about how you draw on your own academic resources. There's always an academic, I think, and always a theoretical argument around most things that we come up against in the institution. It's just finding the right set of arguments to help you work through them. So just encouraging folks to think about the kind of who you need to work with, whose consent you need to win, who do you need on your side, what is it that you need to kind of focus or work around or theorise differently or theorise your way around. When do you need to do this? Is there urgency for you? Have you got a time frame? I mean, for us, REF is an important marker. I'm sure it is for everybody else. And this creative practice forms a really, really important of the story that we'll be telling in our REF environment statement, but also through our outputs in our case studies. And the how, I think, is a little bit of what we're grappling with at the moment, particularly around the how of performative doctorates and how we get those to examination and what it is we take to examination. So, over to you folks.
Are there comments from the floor? As Alex said, treating her work as a provocation, are there examples that come from your institutes that this would be a good time to air them and to talk about some of the challenges that you've had in your institutes?
Maybe it's just us that's found it difficult.
Or maybe...
I just wanted to pick up on, I'm actually here representing many of our supervisors who really wanted to be here today, unfortunately had other commitments. So I'm actually the person who writes the regs. I'm taking copious notes for them. But I'm also just taking copious notes for me because we've just received our DAC and we are in the process of writing up our new regulations to make sure that we are able to offer as broadly as possible. And that's one of the things we are actually asking ourselves is how do we have a credible set of regulations, but a set of regulations which enables rather than restricts. And we've been throwing wording around like crazy. It's really quite difficult. I was really interested to see how you had approached that. I just wondered if you could sort of maybe talk through some of the reasons behind your approach to the wording, because we're finding that every time we think we've got it, somebody says, oh, but that would restrict somebody doing that.
Yeah. I mean, I can't take responsibility for the wording. That was our lovely friend Becky Boydell in the registry, who I have to say is a great sport, but she's been here a long time. I think that helps as well. She knows our community, and there's a lot of trust between Doctoral Research College and us around things like this. But I think it's also how we as academics see them. We can choose to see them as barriers, or we can choose to see them as opportunities. And I think the thing about our regulations, or most regulations that I've come across in the examining roles as well, is they tend to use words like usually, normally, so they don't tend to kind of tie you in and lock you down. But also that they are empirical material that we can talk to against. They are discourse, aren't they? They're part of the academic discourse.
I mean,
so there's no reason why.
God at the moment.
Yeah, but there's no reason why that can't become the subject of what you need to write about. I did that in my PhD. I didn't want a findings section. I was doing a piece of post-qualitative work. So the idea of regulations kind of manifested a particular kind of discourse I was working against. So nobody seemed to find that a problem as long as you make a credible argument about it. But I don't envy you having that task. And I'm sure we could put you in touch with Becky in our office, who's already been through this process, and would, I'm sure, be only too happy to talk to you about it. But yeah, it's not a task I'd want.
Other questions from the floor, or examples from the floor? You may have other examples at your institutes that have helped you overcome some of these barriers that we've talked about here.
It's not actually leading on to that, it's actually more a question about what you were talking about. Interested in the way you phrased sophistication of assessment practice in terms of that as probably a barrier to change, rather than where I am at the moment, University of Gloucestershire.
Just turn it off. Sorry.
University of Gloucestershire, where we've got a lot of space to change that. What I'm interested in is actually moving on that discourse internally.
Sorry. Sorry.
I wonder whether to stop or carry on. I'll probably
say it again.
that. You mentioned sophistication of assessment practice.
Yeah.
And I think that was referring to an internal process. that to me is also something I'm very interested in moving on
Yeah.
internally at my institution.
Yeah.
I think listening through the years of various levels of assessment, for want of a better word,
Yeah.
that to me is often where I find failure within the system.
Yeah, no, I agree. Because that wasn't anything to do with it, right? Because that was like a conundrum of our own making.
Yeah.
That we'd said, oh, we're going to do this brilliant thing, and you've got, there are 17 ways you can be assessed. Go on then. And we were kind of putting a lot of pressure on our students to do all of the kind of boundary breaking and the new stuff without scaffolding it sufficiently well. So I think it probably took us a cycle of 3 years, I would say, to move from everyone submitting 5,000 words to people doing like the kind of stuff that you see outside. And a lot of that was work on ourselves. So it was work on ourselves about how confident we felt about assessing things, about the kind of conversation we had with students about assessing, about the methodology we used in the classroom around creative practice, and we do quite a lot of experimental work in our teaching. But yeah, we had to do most of that work in order to secure that confidence from our students that we would know what to do if they decided to do a dance, or that we would say we weren't sure what we were going to do, and they would trust us to work our way through it. So I did think I don't know, colleagues who on the programme, thinking about...
I think there was quite a lot of emphasis put into the kind of moderation stage of assignments, because I wish we'd captured it now, but the conversations we had in this moderation meetings were really, really powerful conversations, because they were all about pedagogy, all about the assessment of what we were doing. They were quite strategic. They weren't sort of, the traditional sort of conversation you have in moderation. So, and I think it was flashing out that argument and that position, our own positionality, was extraordinarily important, and understanding really the kind of repertoire, building a repertoire of contention. We needed to have a number of contentious practices and understanding what those contentious practices were.
I mean, Louise, Stuart, have you got, from your perspective as being students on that programme and both having produced creative outputs for your assignments, have you got any kind of insights in terms of what we could have done better, what helps you to move to making a vase?
There are always discussions of what you could do better.
No doubt.
But no, from the experience, I think walking into the course, so walking into that environment where, in my head at least, there is a tradition behind it. There is an expected output at the end, and then you walk into the classes, and that's not what they're talking about, and it's not what we're doing in the sessions. That makes it. It doesn't make it easy by any stretch, but it opens up or a thought that actually I don't have to do it that, and by that way I mean the way that I would expect. No one's told me this. I just expect there's a certain way or route that you go down completing a course like this. But that wasn't what was presented. And one of the key elements that I always talk about when I'm talking about my work is the validation. I've got to present this to somebody. Somebody's going to validate what I'm doing. Someone's going to say, well done, this is the right thing. And I think, and I must admit, this palette that Alex and Tony have spoken about, the palette of assessments is just the longest list of things.
I'm going to be talking about it.
Yeah, it is. No spoilers, but it's find something that you can't do, basically. It's that kind of thing. So that validation that I'm always panicked about is never presented by the course. The course never says, oh, but you can't do that. It's always open in terms of, well, have a chat about it, have a discussion about what you can do, as opposed to it being restrictive. And that's not to suggest for a second that they'll allow us to do absolutely anything, but at least it's open. I think that's been my experience. It's been the experience of some others as well.
I think the cohort experience may be important as well, because our professional doctorates run in cohorts. They don't run in block delivery. They're every week, and there's a kind of cohort spirit. And with our doctorate students, we are now starting to kind of recruit them in groups around particular themes. So they're working. So Claire's in a I mean, they were all seeing us on, was it on Tuesday, and they were all down in the cafe going, what should we tell them? Do you remember that? Oh no, it wasn't you, it was Bailey came in last year. It's like, Claire's been in, she said they're all right today. We're all sharing our little bits of stuff and we haven't got anything over here. But, you know, it's like kind of having a little peer group. Would you say that was useful, Claire, having a group of you to...
Yes, yeah, very much so. As you say, you know, we all started at around about the same time, and yeah, we kind of come from relatively sort of similar backgrounds and interests. It's a supportive, nurturing environment from that point of view.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah.
There's a few going on for me. One, just around the regulations in terms of things to think about and that we've had to work through, is not just the regulations in terms of what is then submitted, but right through from how do you interview, how do you do all your milestones, what's required, or how does it map onto the boxes so they're not forever other. So all those kind of things too, so you're not putting mixed messages in the different documentation. But mostly, I was just trying to clarify because I think you're talking about assessment on taught parts of a degree, and I'm wondering, is that right when you're talking about the 5,000?
We were there, but
so I'm just trying to clarify that because that was kind of internal validation, PhD, very interesting. So what happens then at the end? What's being submitted for the PhD thesis? What does that look like for the students in your discipline that aren't necessarily artists, but are using art practice within?
Can we maybe answer that later on in the day?
I think that's
once you
very
see some of the work, I think you'll have answers.
But it's important to say we haven't had a completion yet. This is a new area of work for us. The majority of our students are part-time, so they take 6, 7, 8, sometimes 8 years to complete. And so we are very early on in that journey and borrowing a lot from ADM, which is why we're working. I keep doing that. You won't know that Jacqueline works in ADM. You'll meet her a bit later on. But that's why we're sticking this conversation now of what does it look like? What do you need to submit? What does it all need to be original? Can bits of it be borrowed? You know, and that's why I'm feeling quite anxious about it at this moment. We have got people who are on the cusp of submitting.
So we'll come back to that one because I think it's easy to answer.
You'll see it's a recurring thing.
I guess I would ask, and we might throw it into the conversation, one of the things I'm really interested in is, even for artists submitting practice, there's all sorts of questions about enskillment and what skills are you working on and how is that assessed. The fact that most artistic degrees we know aren't being asked to change the practice examination, they're only being asked to do corrections to writing. So there's all sorts of issues in there, and I'm wondering what the hell that means when you've got somebody who's a health practitioner who has no art skill, or not necessarily no art skill, isn't a specialist artist.
I think you're right. I mean, I came out of that chair in the conservatoire with more questions than I went in. I thought I was going to go in and it was all going to become completely transparent to me and I'd be able to go back and go, this is how you do it. But of course the debate was raging in that room between the two examiners, one who had a computational background and one who had a theoretical background. You know, and it was a kind of touch and go for the candidate in terms of what he was going to have to do and how much he was going to have to resubmit. But yeah, it's clearly alive and well in that discipline, so it's a kind of double whammy for us. If they've got to perform in terms of their own theoretical and disciplinary field, but also if they're choosing an art form, it's got to be credible within that kind of context as well. So yeah, it's a double whammy, and no easy answers.
Thanks very much, Kendall. As you can see, already it's starting.